Welcome and thank you for checking in at the Inner Game of Change podcast, where I focus on exploring the multi-layers of managing organizational change. My guests cover a diverse number of critical topics to enable effective and sustainable change in the workplace. My name is Ali Jaman, and you're listening to the Inner Game of Change podcast. My guest today is author, speaker, and applied behavioural scientist Rory Gallagher. Rory is the co-author of the book Think Small, The Surprisingly Simple Ways to Reach Big Goals, leading the Behavioural Insights teams in Australia and Asia Pacific. Rory is a thought leader and advocate for delivering social impact through applied behavioural science and scaling what works. I'm grateful to have Rory sharing his passion, thoughts, and some of his works with me today. So Rory, thank you so much for joining the Inner Game of Change podcast. I really appreciate your time.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Rory, just very quickly, do you want to share with our audience just something about your background and how you've become, are you a behavioral scientist?
An applied behavioural scientist, I think I would describe myself as. But yes, my name's Rory. I head up the Behavioural Insights Team's work in the APAC region. I'm based in Sydney, and our Sydney office sort of covers Australia and the Pacific, working with lots of government agencies, philanthropies, and increasingly corporates too. I was part of the original sort of so-called nudge unit, and it was set up in the UK back in 2010 under David Cameron, and moved out here to Sydney in late 2012.
Fantastic. And Rory, do you want to share with us what's the premise behind behavioral insight or behavioral economics in general?
Yeah, the central premise is that humans behave in predictable ways, but that is not always consistent with traditional neoclassical economic models. And the way that we design lots of government policies, services, and actually organizations is around these sort of classic, econs, as Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein put in. And the work of Danny Kahneman and others have really sort of brought to light how systematic these biases and patterns of behavior are. And the central metaphor that Danny Kahneman uses is that we have these system 1 and system 2 behaviors. System 1 are our automatic behaviors. If I say 2 times 2, 4 will pop into your head. Most mornings when we sort of get up, we sort of eat our breakfast, and we used to commute into the office on autopilot. Most of our decisions and our sort of daily behaviors are driven by that system 1 behavior. On the other hand, we have our system 2 behaviors, which are more reflective. They take more cognitive energy. If I say 24 times 17, it doesn't automatically pop into your head. You have to work it out. And if we think about, as the world starts to open up, international travel or even sort of travel out of your city, you have to really think about and plan that route. And that takes a bit different part of your brain to do so. But most of our government policies, most of our systems, etc., are designed around that system 2, as if people sit down, rationally weigh up what is in their best interest, both now and in the long term, and then take a decision. And that's just not the way that we behave in real life. So a lot of what behavioural insights, behavioural science does is try to reorientate our policies and our systems and organizations to take into account that dual method of thinking and design a lot more for system 1 as well as system 2 behaviors.
And I think Richard Thaler called it right when he wrote a book called Customer Misbehaving.
Yeah. I mean, Richard, as you know, is just a fantastic scholar and has this amazing ability to take very deep economic principles and concepts and sort of bring them to life through everyday anecdotes. And the book Nudge with Cass Sunstein was really what put this whole approach onto the policy map. And exactly that, slightly tongue-in-cheek,
yes.
He highlights how the sort of vagaries of our everyday behavior, what might seem sort of counterintuitive, why and how they are driven by some of these system 1 and system 2 processes.
So Rory, people, including myself, we think we would like to behave rationally, but most of the time the outcome does not match that way of thinking. We don't do it out of bad intention. That's just the way it is. And we rely mostly on system 1. Is that what it is?
Yeah, I think that's right. you made a point there about intentions, and there is a very common bias and that is often referred to around the intention action gap.
Yes.
That is that we all have these very good intentions. We all want to eat more healthily. We all want to, or many of us want to be more physically active. We want to save more. We want to spend more time with our friends. We want to learn various instruments and cooking, but we fail to follow through. And we would have seen a lot of that as sort of lockdown progresses. You sort of start with all of these great ideals. We have all of these great plans, but life gets in the way. And a lot of what behavioral science, what we try to do is think about, well, how can you lock in some of those positive intentions? How do you try and reduce that intention action gap? And often it is not just by increasing people's knowledge or their willpower. It is about designing systems which help you to unlock those good intentions.
Yeah, so sometimes information is not enough. Actually, talking about COVID, it was not just the information, it was too much information that sort of created the ambiguity for us. So, and when we are in an ambiguous space, what do? We default to the no and inaction. Am I close to right here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about most of our sort of major societal challenges, information is not the key problem. Like if you think about obesity, we know that chips and burgers are they are not good for us. And yet we continue to eat them. We continue to allow our cities to be full of fast food outlets for them to aggregate around schools, etc. So the problem is not really an information one. Often it is more system driven. In COVID, you're exactly right in that in some ways there has been an information overload, many of which are concepts that people can't really get their heads around. So, the different efficacy of different vaccinations, etc. There's almost, an information overload there for people. And in fact, we've done quite a lot of work to show that even at this point in the crisis, I should say, we are now in October 21, in case this doesn't go out immediately. There is still a huge amount of misunderstanding. For example, even some of the basics of transmission that people don't really understand, the likelihood of transmitting or catching COVID indoors or outdoors. And that's because some of those core principles have actually been outweighed by the sort of massive everyday information about number of cases, number of tests, number of vaccinations, etc.
Yes. So I'll just talk about nudges because that's actually one sort of common term for the behavior. So what you're looking at is that you define a problem, which is why do people not behave in the way that is right for them and for the community? And you try to understand the barriers and then expose them, do some tests, look at the evidence, and then apply. Is that what it is?
Yeah, I think that's a good description of our methodology. And actually, your first line is actually really important. So you made the point that people aren't behaving in a way which you either sort of expect or that they state that they want to. Now, the sort of traditional way of thinking about that, particularly from governments, but in general, is like, well, how do we encourage or motivate or incentivize people to do that? But actually, what we often look at as a first port of call is to try to understand, well, why is it that they are not doing it? What are the barriers that are in place, which means they're not accessing this service or they're not undertaking this behavior that you want them to undertake or that they want to undertake? And often a lot of our work is exactly that. It is trying to strip out frictions and tackle those barriers, whereas the sort of counter approach is often how do we give more information, how do we try and encourage, etc. We've often found that is less effective than removing barriers. And in terms of your point about the method, that is exactly right, in that one of our sort of starting premises is to be clear on what is the behaviors you're trying to change, because we find in many organizations, in many government, we have these high level goals, but it doesn't translate down into, well, what are the actual behaviors that you're trying to change? So we try and isolate those behaviors, and then we undertake various sort of bits of research, both qualitative and quantitative, to try and unpack that problem. So just to give one current example, which is quite live, you'll have seen in the media in Australia and globally, there's been an uptick over the last couple of years in road safety accidents for gig economy workers, food delivery workers, which have been in increasing demand during lockdown. And what we try to do is try to understand, well, why is it that they're not, driving safely, riding safely, etc. And to do that, we will look at, what administrative data, what data do we have on the problem? How can we try and unpack that by speaking to workers, the food delivery platforms and restaurants, and even undertaking that behavior ourselves. So for this particular project, I actually signed up with one of the food delivery platforms. I went through their onboarding system to try to understand, what safety information do you receive? What does it feel like to sign up? And then I went out and did, a couple of evenings of delivery to try and understand, well, what are the pressures? What are the incentives? What are the messages that are built into that process? And through really living that experience, through sort of that empathy for the user, you get a much better sense of what are those barriers that are in the way of the behavior that you want. And then, as you said, we use those insights to come up with a better way of designing the system or designing a particular intervention, and then we test to see whether that actually works in practice.
Yes, sometimes people think that there's some evil intention behind nudges, but the premise behind it is that we would like to remove all the frictions and the barriers in your way to actually make better choices, and better choices for you and for the community, and the same in the workplace. You make better choices for you and for your customers.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think more of the early fear was that people just didn't know what this looked like in practice, that behavioral scientists or psychologists would be at the heart of government or organizations trying to change our behavior seemed scary. But of course, government and organizations are always trying to influence our behavior. And of course, if you want people to change people's behavior, it's probably better to have a behavioral scientist or a psychologist rather than a lawyer trying to do that. So I think there was some suspicion when we first came in about what is it we're trying to achieve. But over the last decade, as we've published work on everything from trying to encourage people to turn up to hospital appointments, to commute more safely, through to reduce domestic violence or improve uptake of apprenticeships, I think there has become widespread acceptance around these techniques.
How do you train to be a behavioral scientist? Do you even train, or what's your background, Rory?
So I actually did a PhD around behavior change and HIV prevention in Southeast Asia. And there wasn't a decade ago, but there are now lots of dedicated undergraduate as well as master's and PhD programs now, specifically around these behavioral sciences, whether that's in the sort of psych departments or econ departments or often multidisciplinary. And so there are now lots of programs that you can do around the world. And it's really important. Most of our staff will have come through that academic training. But of course, that most of that is around theory and concepts. And the other part of your training is practice and application. So, the evidence will tell you what works often in the labs and in some field experiments. But the real day-to-day practice comes through applying this in your organization or, in your government department. So there are now hundreds of these teams around the world and many, many more sort of individuals practicing these types of techniques in their job. And that to me is where this real fine-grained training comes in. You can learn a lot. You need the academic for your grounding, but you then need to apply that in practice and find out what works in your particular organization.
Absolutely. Look, I work in the business of change management and communication. Well, we work in the business of change, and we try to understand where the resistance comes from, which are the barriers and the friction. We try to understand why a particular group will put up a fight against a particular change. We try to understand how we communicate effectively, creating a narrative. All of those things that actually happens within our practice. And I see a great application or an opportunity to apply the nudges in our business, because everything you're talking about now is actually managing change at a community level, but we can still, the human is a human everywhere. I think there's a great opportunity to apply those practices in the workplace. And I'm not too sure how the corporate world is positioned. What's your experience?
Yeah, I think you're right that there is huge opportunity there. I would say the majority of our work and of nudge units around the world has often focused on individual level behavior change, trying to get, as I said, someone to turn up to an appointment or take up a service, etc. but there are huge opportunities in that corporate and organizational space. Now one argument you could make is that organizations are made up of humans, and as you said, humans are humans. So in many cases, those behaviors and those techniques should follow through. But of course, they interact in particular ways and through particular networks, and so there are particular tools and approaches that you can use within organizations to help try and not just shift individual, but shift team and organizational behaviors. And I think there's, as you said, there are huge opportunities there. I think we've been slightly slow because some of those behaviors can be slightly harder to measure, particularly in a robust way. But I think as we've evolved over the last decade, we have advanced our sort of techniques about how we can not just influence, but also measure change. And if you think about now, we've got one of the biggest sort of change management challenges that any organization will have had, which is how do you sort of reintegrate people back into workplaces, and how do you take advantage of some of the opportunities and productivity gains we've seen through the sort of shift to remote working, whilst also plugging some of the gaps and some of the shortfalls that we've seen from those periods. So we're doing bits of work now with different organizations to try to understand, how do we lock in the good and plug the bad that we've seen over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I 3 or 4 years ago, I was introduced to the acronym EAST, which stands for make it easy, make it attractive, make it social, and make it timely. And some people add the word F at the end, will make it fun as well. I'll share with you some of the stuff that I've already done in the workplace. And for example, it's a no-brainer to make it easy for people to interact with you. It's no-brainer to make it easy for example, I was working with a retail organization, and I made it easier for their store managers to apply the changes by giving them a checklist. So checklists are really wonderful things. I worked a lot around friction cost because they run their workforce based on budget and outcome. And so that was their concern. So if I remove that and I neutralize it, then there's more likelihood for them to adopt the change and make it happen. I worked a lot around chunking and simplification around it as well. Similar to the attractive, the loss aversion is a real thing in the workplace. So we work on that as well. The social is such a fantastic thing. Commitment contract. Like even my son now, I get him to write his own day schedule himself. That is a nudge. The messenger effects, we need the sponsor to actually launch big events. The network nudge. We show that other people are already, or other stores are already using it, and they're successful already. So that's a social nudge and developing norms. And even we got all the way to make it timely. We gave prompts. We gave head starts. We get the implementation intention by giving them roadmaps. Some of these are reason why all the premiers now talk about a roadmap. So I think there is a real application, and this is not manipulation. This is actually making it easier for people to adopt the changes.
Yeah, look, that's a really great selection of specific nudges you can use within organizations. And you're right, the EAST framework or principles was really our attempt to say, now we've been doing this for a decade and we've been, running hundreds of these projects. What are the most common levers that you can pull to change behavior? So it's not supposed to be sort of comprehensive or necessarily even mutually exclusive, but they are the principles. We know that if you're working with an organization or a government department, they haven't got time to go and dip into the academic literature in any great depth. They can't, go and read Kahneman and others. But they can use these simple levers of change. And as you just sort of depicted there, within each of those letters, easy, attractive, social, and timely, there are numbers of tools and techniques that you can pull to try and, as you said, change behavior. You didn't mention the F and fun, which is, as you said, one that Cass Sunstein and others have been pushing recently, and we've done probably less on. But I think it is also worth thinking within organizations.
Yes.
How do you make it at least enjoyable or fun? And so you can think about, again, as we return to workplaces, how do you make it as easy and attractive as possible for people to come back in? And how do you make it fun? How do you want help people want to come into the office and to interact with colleagues? And so I think there is rightly a focus on how do you create spaces for interaction? How do you provide lunches? How do you try and have team bonding events after people haven't seen each other for a long time? So exactly as you said, there is almost like a toolbox of nudges and techniques that we can use, and organizations, I think, have often dipped into these, but they often don't do so in a systematic way, and they don't test to see their efficacy. So they sort of throw a lot of stuff and see what sticks. And actually, as you've depicted, by using them in a slightly more surgical and systematic way, you can get much more bang for your buck.
Yeah, and I think, Rory, the idea of fun defines the change experience at the end of the day. So you can adopt it, but then we need to measure how satisfied you were with the experience as well. And that satisfaction feeds into the engagement later. So it's not only the product, it's how I feel about it as well. That's why, the iPhone and all that stuff, if we just wanted a phone, we didn't really have gotten to all those developments. It's just the feeling, and it feeds into other things like status, like ease of use and all of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see how notions of sort of enjoyment and fun also impacts sort of big economic decisions. Like I would imagine there are lots of people around the country right now spending a long time on travel websites searching for slightly cheaper flights to shave $20 off a hotel or a flight, and yet their super will be sitting there, their mortgage will be sitting there costing them, thousands that they just won't engage with because the market is more complex. They are not salient or fun for these people to do. So those notions definitely affect organizational behavior, as you noted. They also impact on some of the sort of major economic decisions that we take as well.
Fantastic. So in simple terms, can you explain to me what a nudge is and also what a sludge is?
Yeah, so a nudge is defined as a change to a system or process which doesn't require compulsion or financial incentives in order to, as you mentioned earlier, change a behavior to a way that accords with an individual's and society's wishes. So that basically means, how do you make someone do something without mandating them to do it or paying them, incentivizing them to do it? And so classic examples in that space are, how do you change defaults? How do you frame messages in different ways? And how do you send reminders? Are some of the classic examples that you've already talked about. Yeah. Sludge is essentially the opposite of that, which are, what are those frictions that get in the way of the behaviors that we want to see? And there are almost sort of two types of sludge in my mind. There is deliberate sludge, and there is sort of accidental sludge. Deliberate sludge is often used sort of in the corporate space in order to maximize profit. And so some examples of that might be, the classic one that Richard Thaler always talks about is these days, lots of companies make it very, very easy for you to sign up to a subscription, and they might give you sort of 3 months free, but they make it very, very hard for you to then exit that subscription. Yeah. So they've built in sludge to the process, so that if you do want to cancel, you have to go on, you have to email into this website, which complete this form, which is difficult to find, etc. And they do that in order to sort of maximize their corporate objectives. So that I would put that in the bucket of deliberate, and there are obviously shades of grey around that. Not all are quite so obvious. Accidental sludge, I would put more in the bucket of just the layers of bureaucracy that have built up over time, and frictions which have built up often accidentally, which just make it harder to access government services or for you to change your behavior. And so lots of the things that we do in our work has often been sort of tackling this accidental sludge that over time bits of legislation, bits of policies have built up, or they've just not been designed around human behavior, so it isn't as easy as we would like. And a lot of what we do then is chipping away at that sludge to make it easier for people to follow through on their behavior.
Fantastic. Hi there. Thank you for listening to this podcast. For more podcasts, check us out at theinnergameofchange.com.au. Rory, I want to talk about your book. But before I get to that, do you want to share with us some work that you're working on right now that is contemporary and may contribute to some community benefits?
Yeah, I mean, I've mentioned one very briefly, which is about trying to now help organizations return to workplaces in sort of safe and productive manners. But maybe one other, which is a little more sort of complex in terms of the behaviors.
Is that predominantly with the government?
That is both with government and with corporates,
sure.
The return to workplaces. And I think there'll be lots of follow-on opportunities and work over the next year as we now try to reorientate our physical workplaces, change our ways of working, so we all can all be more productive and happier in and outside of work. But maybe just one other example, just to make it a little bit more concrete, is the piece of work that we are doing to try and help young people to behave more ethically online. Again, we would have seen through COVID, there has been lots of debates about information, disinformation, also different individuals' views. And you may have seen this in your own social media feeds and WhatsApp groups, different views around vaccinations, etc. And you can often see that those debates don't happen in a productive way. So we are running a program which is funded by the Vincent Fairfax Family Foundation to work with teenagers, year 9 specifically, and we do an 8-week program with them, which teaches them about ethics online. It shows them their data on their usage of technology and social media, gives them insights, and they collectively agree what is right and wrong. And it gives them tools and strategies to react and to behave more ethically online. And I'm really excited about the opportunities in that space. We know that young people's well-being and their behaviors are absolutely critical. And if we can help them to use technology and social media better, I think it will not only be of a huge benefit to them, but also for society more widely.
Well done, Rory. It's a very worthwhile exercise to look at that particular segment of society. And I'm talking like you, I'm a father, so I welcome anything. In fact, I was talking to a friend the other day, and I said to him, I'm trying to be a data-driven parent. So I look at the report that Netflix gives me and what my son watches and the patterns and themes, and the same for his watch. Him and I go through the reports of his exercise, and then we see slight modification. Oh, I didn't even realize that I was actually doing that. And so data can be useful, and the insight out of the data is the useful piece. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And look, you two great examples there of explosions of data, personal data and personal usage data that we've seen over the last few years. You know, I'm wearing a Garmin watch now.
Me too.
And I know that my personal activity and the way that I sort of keep fit is much, much better when I have these feedback mechanisms to tell me how fast I'm running, to tell me how many steps that I'm taking. So we know these tools can be really useful if you do use the insights in the right way. Netflix is kind of an interesting example you bring up, just because it shows almost the inequity in how some of these approaches are being used. So, there are campuses full of incredibly smart behavioral scientists and data scientists also looking at that data and varying the sort of thumbnails, etc., that you would see and that your son sees in order to influence their behavior, right? There are huge amounts of resource which are being targeted to influence what your son watches.
Yeah.
The amount of data and amount of effort that it's been taking to work out how to help him choose different subjects or to study for exams is much, much lower. And in fact, he'll probably take sort of decisions around his career based on often what you've told him, a teacher has told him, and probably a cursory sort of look around the internet. And so actually, we try to think about how do we use these data systems to try and lead to better outcomes for people like your son? How do we create systems so there is lots and lots of data about the type of subjects you can take, about the type of careers that you can go into, and try to understand the different impacts on well-being as well as sort of salary and all those sorts of things.
And it's a great point, Rory, because I always look at those patterns and look at those themes. However, I try to bring intervention in there. So I'll choose something that he doesn't usually choose. And by doing that, we watch it together, introduce him to new ways of looking at things, which kind of even out, the reporting that Netflix gives me. Because if I leave him and he'll make the choice, it will be like that cycle of I see something, then they nudge me to look at something. And then, of course, themes will evolve after that. And I try to break them by introducing him to something new that he hasn't even thought about watching.
Yeah, look, that's a great example of you trying to effectively nudge your son's behavior by sharing that experience. That can be very powerful, prompt new experiences, etc. And that's what we often see the most effective nudges are, where you can sort of share experiences as well as set what we call in the psych literature bright lines. So, for example, with my kids, we say no TV in the morning in the working week. They're allowed it at the weekends, because we know that is then just a much easier behavior to stick to than anyone with young kids will know. If you say, well, you only watch one, then you get into these endless discussions and negotiations, which are just harder to police. And so trying to think about what are those bright lines that you can apply in your own life, whether that's, no drinking in the week, whether it is I'm always going to do exercise on a particular day of the week, etc. They're the sorts of things that you can much more likely to help you to follow through and stick to the behaviors that you want.
And that's a great segue to your book, Think Small. So Think Small, and I think you mentioned that in the book. It's got a framework which is really predominantly focused on me as an individual rather than on the outside. So looking from inside out rather than outside in. But the idea is that we can think small, but we can still dream big.
Yeah, I think that's ultimately what it is. You can still reach big goals, but the way to do that is by breaking them down and setting in place a series of systems which help you to achieve that goal. The problem is we often dream big, but then we don't set in place those systems and processes, so we often fall short. Most of our well-intentioned goals never come into fruition. Most New Year's resolutions are broken by the end of January, and many before the end of the first week of January. So really what the book is about is how do you set up those systems to try and encourage and help you to achieve these goals. And we like to think of that really as the behavioral scaffolding, the sort of protections that you can put in place for yourself in order to achieve those goals. And you're absolutely right. The sort of primary audience when we were thinking about this was individuals. How do we change our behavior? How do we reach our individual goals? But actually you can apply these 7 principles equally, I think, to organizations and change management. The 7 principles around setting goals, around planning to achieve them, setting commitments, sort of sharing those goals, providing feedback and rewards, and then sticking to these goals. You could equally see how they could be applied to organizations and change management.
Look, I'm a big believer of the chunking into small pieces, and it works for me all the time. I start small, and then I add another step to it, and another step, and before I know it, I've got something to work with. I am a marathon runner, so I understand the principle of just go for the first step and the second, and before you know it, you're way ahead. Big believer of the smaller steps, and start with the first step, especially here nowadays when you've got lots of information, but you've got lots of big achievers in the world, and you think, what are my chances to achieve anything? And so therefore I'm going to default and do nothing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think part of what we talk about at the start of the book is also setting the right type of goals. The problem with many goals is you're not aiming for the right thing anyway in the first place. It's either something that you don't really buy into or isn't ultimately going to make you happy. And then often they are unrealistic. So exactly as you said, how do you set the right type of goal, and then how do you break it down into its constituent parts and focus on achieving one at a time? It also links to a point you made around sports and this sort of notion of marginal gains. Almost all successful athletes and teams will be focused on these marginal improvements to their diet, to their sleep, to their training, and that is what sets you apart from the crowd. And obviously that is elite level sort of sports, but you can apply the same thing to your own. Like, what are the trainers that you run best in? What are the conditions? Is it sort of running in the morning? Is it, what's the sort of diet that you require in order to do that? And I made the point about the sort of Garmin or other watches, and you can really feel the difference between if you just go out for a jog and if you set yourself a target of how fast you want to run and you're looking to see your speed that you're running. They lead to very different types of outcomes. And we talk about that in the book, and more broadly, this notion of sort of deliberative practice that, you can kick a ball around your garden. And I have done lots and lots of this over my lifetime and never get any better at football, particularly because you don't practice using, for example, your left foot. So it always remains quite poor. That is very different to much more deliberative practice where you set out a training regime. You're going to work on your passing, your dribbling, your shooting, your left foot, your right foot, your heading, and then you will significantly improve. And that's a problem with a lot of our goals. Actually, people aren't setting these deliberative targets. They're just going for a run, which is a good first step. But once you get over that initial hurdle of just getting off the couch, actually it is about the frequency with which you run and then the times with which you are aiming in order to actually make sort of progress and drive performance.
You had an example in the book about managing your own diet.
Yeah, although as you will see with these things, they need constant vigilance. And, this was just I think from the book, the example of, for me in the lead up to the wedding, trying to use these bright lines. All of us struggle if you try and just eat more healthily. It's often hard to know what does that mean in practice. So one of the techniques that many people find successful is things like intermittent fasting, or the 5-2 diet, where you just calorie restrict on a couple of days and then you can eat what you want on the other days, because it's just very clear the behaviors that you need to follow, as opposed to just trying to eat healthily. There are lots of other options, cutting certain things out of your diet that, that may be contributing to overweight, or alcohol. But that's really the key for me, is less around the sort of specific diet and thinking about what are those rules that you need to have in place. Is it you're not going to have any crisps in the house, or you're just not going to eat crisps in front of the TV? Yeah. Is it no drinking in the week? What are the things that you can do that you can genuinely stick to? Like, so for example, just saying you're not going to drink alcohol ever. That's your goal. Is that realistic? Maybe it is, but for many people, it might be the better approach is to cut out certain drinking in certain types of places, days of the week, or certain types of alcohol, for example.
I manage myself. So, I look at the book and I'm thinking it's my opportunity to know a little bit about myself and my level of self-discipline, but also it can guide me to say, take smaller steps. And then start somewhere and then see how we go and reassess. And then, but if the purpose is strong enough, you will still be there, and there's no suffering attached to it. It's in your own time, at your own pace. Actually, talking about the alcohol, one rule that I have is that I don't have alcohol stacked in the house, so I don't drink. And if I want to buy something, I'll buy it in the weekend. That's it. And so that's just my way of saying, if it's not there, I don't drink it. And then, that's just my small step.
But that's a great example, right, of the biggest change that we can see in people's behaviors where you change the environment. So the example that you talked about there is an environmental change, right? So that you don't have the alcohol in your house other than for specific occasion. That is much, much, much more likely to be effective than just saying, I'm not going to drink when I'm in the house and there's a cupboard full of alcohol sat there for when you have a weak moment. And I guess that is exactly the type of example that we're trying to encourage, which is to say, how do you make changes to your environment to make it more likely you will succeed? Because you're right. Many of us set these goals, we don't fulfill them, then we blame ourselves as if we are bad people. But actually, a lot of this is much wider system and environmental factors and environmental cues. It's not an accident that our plate sizes have got bigger, or our junk food is marketed to us aggressively in all of our sort of supermarket promotions and on our TVs, etc. These are external factors which are influencing our behavior, and a lot of this is about how do you correct some of that and set yourself up for success. The other example that you gave earlier around, watching shows with your son is quite a good one to think about in goals, which is, well, how do you also surround yourself with people and with other mechanisms to help you achieve that change. And I think there's a good lesson there for organizations. How do you set clear goals, have a clear purpose, and then get your workforce to work together to achieve those goals? Fantastic.
We are coming to the end of the podcast, Rory. It's been really tremendous, and I'm more than ever committed to applying lots of this particular science. If you were to give a business leader an advice or sort of a direction on how to approach behavioral economics or nudges in the workplace, what would your advice be?
I think it would be we have a framework which is called test, learn, adapt.
Yes.
And I think that is absolutely critical, which is try to apply this in practice, set some KPIs, set some measure, and work out if it is effective or how effective, and then adapt from there. This isn't a sort of one-hit opportunity. We often talk about, if you're using this for the first time, try and aim for something which you can measure success relatively quickly. So, it's probably not helpful to say we're going to use these techniques and we'll find out in 5 years whether the corporate strategy worked. You're better to do something which you can measure relatively quickly and get practice using these tools. So often in government and with organizations, we'll say start with the low-hanging fruit. To the examples that you talked about earlier, what are the changes to communications and these light touch nudges that you can make within your organization, and then see what works for you and your organization and go from there. And I think the second point I would have is around a sort of real curiosity around human behavior and humility about what we know and what we don't know. Get out there and try and understand, speak to your staff, speak to your users, and try to understand what are the behaviors. And as we talked about at the start, what is getting in the way of those behaviors, and see if you can strip them away.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I hope in the new year I'll get you back and we're going to talk more about the work that you're doing. But it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. I really appreciate your time, Rory.
Pleasure. A great commitment device and nudge from you there to get us back. But look, as I sort of said, I think there is huge opportunities in the sort of change management and organizational behavior space. I think we've slightly undercooked that over the past decade, but that's what makes me excited to stay in the field and have these sorts of conversations to look forward to the decade ahead.
How would people reach you, Rory?
You can drop me a line is probably the best way. My email is rory.gallagher@bi.team. Or add me on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And until next time, stay well and stay safe.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of the Inner Game of Change podcast. To know more about our guests and this episode, check out the innergameofchange.com.au website. And remember to subscribe. I can't wait to share with you the next episode. Until then, stay well and stay safe.